The encounter at the cafe, when kindness speaks. All right, everyone, listen up because I've got a great story to tell you. This story begins in a completely ordinary place, a small roadside cafe, the kind where the chairs don't match and the scent of burnt coffee lingers in the air. But trust me, what happened there that day was anything but ordinary. It was the kind of moment that etches itself into your memory, the kind that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about kindness, about judging others, about the quiet power a single person can hold. So, picture this, the cafe is packed, morning rush hour as usual. The clinking of cups, the murmur of conversations, the hustle of people trying to get their caffeine fix to start the day. Then, a guy walks in, you wouldn't really give him a second glance. He's wearing a simple hoodie, jeans, sneakers, just blending into the crowd. Just another face in the sea of people, not particularly eye-catching, but there's something about him. You find yourself glancing back again, wondering if you saw something unusual. The guy stands in line, orders a basic coffee, nothing fancy. But behind the counter, there's a barista. Let's call him Danny. Danny is the kind of guy who thinks he's God's gift to customer service, though, in reality, well, let's just say he's lacking. He wears a smug grin plastered on his face, impatient with everyone. He has a sharp tongue and isn't afraid to use it. Our quiet stranger, let's call him Mr. Steve, notices Danny's attitude but doesn't say anything. He simply waits his turn. But Danny? He's putting on a show. His sarcastic remarks about the growing line are getting louder, and just as he's about to throw out an especially rude comment, he notices Mr. Steve. And that's when everything starts. Danny, in all his arrogance, makes a careless remark about how the cafe isn't a shelter for the homeless. Yes, he actually said that. He looked right at Mr. Steve and said it. Their eyes met, an unspoken acknowledgement that things were about to shift. Danny didn't see it coming. He leaned in further, his smug grin widening, and added another jab. Something about this place being for people who know how to dress properly. Mr. Steve remained calm. His face didn't change, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes, the kind that could make you uneasy. He didn't say anything as Danny turned to fetch his drink. And as a final jab, Danny muttered something along the lines of, "Better hurry up, I don't have time to wait around for the homeless." And then, the cafe fell silent. Like someone had flipped a switch. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. The air grew heavy, tense. Mr. Steve didn't move. His expression remained unchanged, but his presence, it was like a shield. Danny turned away, oblivious, but Mr. Steve stood there, reflecting on the moment. A decision was forming, you could feel it. Danny, still unaware, turned back with Mr. Steve's coffee, that mocking smirk still stuck to his face. "Here you go, hope you enjoy it, buddy," he said. With all the forced politeness he could muster, Danny handed over the coffee. He was expecting a grumbled "thank you," maybe even a tip, but nothing more. Instead, Mr. Steve looked at him, straight in the eyes. He was assessing him, you could see it. For the first time, Danny seemed uneasy, as if he was beginning to reconsider his own words. Then, Mr. Steve took a deep breath, and in a calm, steady voice, he said something that changed everything. "You know, there are moments in life when we get to choose who we want to be." Danny, confused, shrugged. "What do you mean?" Mr. Steve stepped a little closer, lowering his voice just enough so that people could hear, but not so much as to create a scene. "You chose to humiliate someone who did nothing wrong. But the truth is, we never really know who we're speaking to until it's too late. Today, you made a mistake." Danny let out a nervous chuckle. "Oh, come on, it was just a joke. No harm meant," but Mr. Steve slowly shook his head. He paused, looking around the cafe, letting his words settle in. "No, it wasn't just a joke. People like you hide behind jokes to make others feel small, and that's not something I will ever laugh at." By now, the entire cafe was paying attention. Danny was clearly uncomfortable. This wasn't about rudeness or revenge. Mr. Steve was speaking from a place of understanding. You think it's funny to belittle people, to use your position to put others down. But remember, life doesn't always work that way. It has a funny way of turning things around, and when it does, we can either stand tall or shrink away. Danny's confident facade wavered. He glanced around the cafe, locking eyes with the people who had just witnessed this exchange. And then, like a coin finally dropping, he realized, this was no longer just a quiet cafe. This was a place where his actions were being watched, judged, weighed. Mr. Steve smiled, not out of malice, but out of empathy. You might want to think about the words you choose, because, you see, life has a way of teaching us lessons. It's best to learn them before it's too late, and with that, Mr. Steve picked up his coffee, leaving Danny standing there, a mess of confusion and guilt swirling across his face. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted once again. Now, it was quieter, more reflective. Mr. Steve walked over to a table, his mind still lingering on the brief exchange. He gazed out the window, lost in thought. The cafe was still buzzing with murmured conversations, but there was something different in the air, an uneasiness, a shift. Danny remained frozen behind the counter. He glanced at the crowd, then at Mr. Steve, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The arrogance that had made it so easy for him to put others down had vanished. Not because he had been caught, but because deep down, he knew Mr. Steve was right. He had taken his position for granted, using his words to wound instead of heal. And now, there was no easy way out. Then, Danny approached Mr. Steve. His steps were slow, hesitant. "I'm sorry," he said, almost in a whisper. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I was just having a bad day." Mr. Steve looked up, his face still calm, but there was understanding in his eyes. "Everyone has bad days," he replied. "But how we treat others on those days, that's what really matters." Danny nodded. He had never seen Mr. Steve in this way before. Not as an actor, not as a celebrity, just as a man who had spoken to him, not with anger, but with a truth that cracked something inside him. "I don't want to make excuses," Danny continued. "I've been in a rough spot, life's been hard, and I guess I took it out on you." He hesitated, then added, "I didn't realize who you were. I thought you were just someone unimportant." Mr. Steve gave a small, knowing smile and set his coffee cup down. "We are all important," he said gently. "But sometimes, we forget that. We forget that we're all just trying to get through, doing our best. We forget that a little kindness can change everything." Danny's eyes glistened with unshed tears, as if the weight of his own actions had finally settled upon him. Mr. Steve hadn't just taught him a lesson in humility, he had shown him the power of compassion, the power to lift others up. For the first time in a long while, Danny didn't feel like the one in control. He felt like someone who had been given a chance to do better. "Thank you," Danny whispered. "Thank you for teaching me that. I don't think I could have learned it any other way." Mr. Steve stood up, preparing to leave, but he looked back one last time. "Remember," he said, "it's never too late to start doing better. But you have to start now. Change only happens when we take responsibility for our actions." And with that, he stepped out of the cafe, leaving Danny lost in his own thoughts. As Mr. Steve walked away, the cafe remained silent. People looked at each other, unsure of what had just happened. They had witnessed a change in someone's soul. A real transformation. And they knew that what had unfolded before them was something they would not forget. The cafe was no longer the same. The ordinary had been replaced by something extraordinary. Behind the counter, the waiter looked like a man trying to process an earthquake. How many times had he used his position to belittle others, thinking himself untouchable? Today, that illusion had crumbled, and he was faced with a choice. To let this moment pass, or to let it change him forever. People began to leave the cafe. Some nodded at Danny in acknowledgement. Some spoke kind words, while others simply offered understanding smiles. It was as if they had all shared in this moment of awakening. It was no longer just about Mr. Steve's actions. It was about how they had sparked something deeper. Danny wasn't the only one who had changed. As people reflected, they realized they, too, had been blind to their own flaws. And many of them silently vowed to be a little kinder. Across the street, a young woman stopped in her tracks. She had been walking past just as Mr. Steve entered the cafe, and she had witnessed the entire exchange. She was facing struggles of her own, battling feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt. But Mr. Steve's words, they resonated deeply. She found herself wiping away tears. Maybe it wasn't too late for her either. Maybe she, too, could start over. Back inside the cafe, Danny finally moved. His gaze had softened, filled with reflection. He took a deep breath and turned to his coworker. I think I need to make things right. It was a small step, but it was one that would begin to reshape his future. The cafe was no longer the same. In that moment, it had transformed. It had become a place where empathy and kindness spread like wildfire. And it all started with Mr. Steve, not as a celebrity, but as a man who cared enough to stand up for what was right. Later, Mr. Steve watched the city move around him. He didn't know the full impact of his words, but he didn't need to. The ripple effect had already begun. He thought about his own struggles, the times life had tried to knock him down, the moments he had doubted his own worth. But he understood one thing: sometimes, the smallest actions, the gentlest words, could change a person's life. And that day, he had done just that. Days passed. The story of Mr. Steve's quiet wisdom spread like wildfire. People who hadn't even been there had heard about the encounter. The story wasn't about a celebrity saving someone, it was about the power of a simple act of kindness, the courage to stand up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. Danny, profoundly changed, began taking small steps to make amends. He started treating customers with more respect, no longer making sarcastic remarks. His attitude toward himself also shifted. He realized that you can't give what you don't have, and he began learning how to show compassion to himself as well. One day, Danny looked up and saw Mr. Steve walk through the door again. This time, there was no judgment, no sarcastic thoughts. Danny approached him with a genuine smile, an expression of respect. Hello, sir. I just wanted to say thank you. I know I acted like a fool that day, but your words really stuck with me. I've been trying to be a better person. Mr. Steve looked at him, calm and understanding. That's all any of us can do, he replied. We're all just trying our best every day. Danny, unable to hold back the tears welling in his eyes, said, Thank you for giving me the chance to do better. I don't think I'd be here if you hadn't said what you did. Mr. Steve smiled. It was a quiet victory, but it was enough. It was about the steady, continuous change that had been inspired, and for Danny, the change didn't stop there. He began sharing his story, encouraging others to think more deeply about how they treated one another. He became living proof of how a single moment of kindness could ripple outward, transforming not just one life, but many. Danny shared the lessons that Mr. Steve had unintentionally taught him, about kindness, empathy, and the profound impact of even the smallest actions. For the customers who had witnessed it, the effect lingered. They began to see their own behavior in a new light. The next time they saw someone being treated poorly, they remembered Mr. Steve's lesson. They spoke up. They helped. They chose empathy. They, too, had changed. This story, it wasn't something that could be contained in a single moment. It was something that lived on in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. It was something that continued to inspire them to be better, to do better, and to remember the power of their own actions. And in a world where people are quick to tear each other down, sometimes, just a few kind words are enough to create lasting change. As Mr. Steve stepped out of the cafe one last time, he glanced back. He didn't know it, but the effects of his actions had already come full circle. What had begun as a small act of compassion had grown into something far greater than he could have ever imagined, and as he walked down the street, the city around him seemed just a little brighter, just a little kinder, and that was enough. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to watch the next video. See you next time.